Alrighty, I think we are live now. All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leslie Sompko. I'm the Communications Manager for Ercot. In just a few minutes, you're going to be hearing from our President and CEO, Bill Magnus, and our Senior Director of System Operations, Dan Woodfin. I want to start off by acknowledging that this has been a very uncomfortable and frustrating event for so many Texans, and we want you to know that we're working as quickly and safely as possible to restore power. So Bill is going to provide you with an update on our overall response, and then Dan will provide an operational update and give you those updated figures that I'm sure many of you are waiting for. Once they complete their remarks, I will call on a handful of outlets to ask follow-up questions. And when doing so, you will need to unmute on your end of the line in order to ask your question. But I'll reiterate that when we get to that point. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you all for being here. We appreciate you joining us for this update on the grid event here in Ercot. And let me just start by saying the number one priority, what we are focused on above all else, and literally 24 hours a day since this event began, was getting customers their service back. The amount of time that people in Texas have had to be out of service for electricity during a time of extreme cold is terrible. It is unacceptable. And we are trying to manage the electric grid so that we can get those folks back on their service safely and get the electric grid moving in the direction that we try to move it in every day. You know, our fundamental job is to keep the grid reliable by maintaining the balance between generation and load, the balance between supply and demand. What we have seen in this event, the severe winter event, is that imbalance of supply and demand developing to a point Sunday night where we needed to protect the integrity of the grid. We needed to make sure we didn't have an uncontrolled blackout that could last for an indeterminate amount of time. It could take a very long time to get electric service back to people. And while this has certainly taken longer than we had hoped, we're continuing to work towards the restoration of the system as it was last week. When these outages are over, people will be able to have the service that they had before this event. The challenge has been to get the grid in balance, the supply and demand balance effectively in place where we can bring all those customers back. I'm going to ask Dan Woodfin, our Senior Director of Grid Operations, to talk a little bit about the progress we have made in that regard and where we see it heading going forward. I think before I do that, one other thing. I know some of you were here for the background on the event, and you know, we saw this storm coming, both in our weather forecasts and then the forecasts available to the general public. Knew it was coming. The leadership in Texas knew it was coming, asked for a disaster declaration, which was granted last week. A lot of steps have been taken to prepare ourselves for what we're going to be seeing, prepare our market participants for what we saw. And we understood that there may be an imbalance of load and generation that would cause us to do rotating outages yesterday and today because of the size of the disparity between what we were seeing on the historic demand side, higher than we'd ever seen in winter in Texas by far, versus what we were seeing on the supply side. So we saw this coming, but the thing that really shifted matters was Sunday night when we had to call for these outages. And that was because while we were seeing the tremendous demand side growth caused by the storm and the cold associated with it, we saw a large drop in the amount of supply available. And if we had let that supply-demand balance stay too long out of balance, it could have had catastrophic impacts on the grid itself that could take a very, very long time to repair. This has been a very trying event for those Texans who have had to endure it, and we understand that. My power has been out at my home in Austin since Sunday, and I understand the challenges that it's posing to people all over the state. But the work we're doing is to get us back in a place where we can get all customers back up and operate a safe system that doesn't have a risk of that sort of catastrophic event. And that's why we took the actions we did Sunday, and we're working our way through to be sure we can get everybody back on a safe and secure electric grid. So now I'll ask Dan if he could kind of give us an update on some of the key data that I think you may have discussed yesterday about where things stand with our system and its restoration efforts. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Bill. So we have, as the morning occurred this morning, we tend to, the power consumption on the power grid tends to be higher in the morning hours and go down in the middle of the day, come back up in the evening during the winter. And what we saw this morning is we had to increase this amount of load that was out on the system during the early morning hours today. We've been able to bring some power back online, some areas back online as the day has progressed today, and as we've gotten a small amount of additional generation to be available. But we've also, at the same time, we've been adding supply to the grid from certain generators. We've also been losing other generators where they have become unavailable. And so we haven't been able to add as much back during the course of the day that as we'd like to have. And what we have added back, we're hoping to keep online, but if additional generation doesn't become available as the day goes on, we may actually have to take some of it back offline to maintain that power supply balance come this evening. As the load that is being served starts going back up. We have about, the magnitude-wise, we have about 15,000 megawatts of consumers that are out. That's somewhere between 2 and 3 million people that are currently out. So that's the demand side. On the supply side, we have roughly 45,000 megawatts of generation that's offline at the current time. And so that number hasn't progressed as much as we would like for it to, because like I said, we keep losing some as more is added. And it's from a variety of reasons. The generation is out. It's for a variety of reasons and a variety of sources of energy that's being tripped offline. So about 16,000 megawatts of that is wind turbines that are offline because of icing in West Texas, primarily, but also some along the coast. And then we've got about a little under 30,000 megawatts of more thermal generation, like gas, coal, nuclear plants that are out. And so it's really, like I said, a variety of resources that are out. Yeah, and so I guess that's the report right now. Leslie?
Okay, thank you. And Dan, from my perspective, you're out of the frame of the camera a bit. Might want to scoot in a little bit in case anyone's recording this. And Bill, now you're out, so yeah, just to scrunch y'all together. Okay. So I think at this time, now that they've provided their updates, I'm going to go ahead and kick off this question and answer session. I've identified some outlets that I'll call on first, and once those are done, we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. I see that several people are submitting questions through the chat, so I will try to keep up with those. So at this time, I am going to see if anyone from Fox News is on the line, and as a reminder, in order to be heard, you must unmute yourself. But I also ask that if you are not asking a question, please stay muted. We had quite a bit of feedback on the last call. So at this time, if anyone from Fox News has a question they would like to ask, please unmute yourself and identify yourself. Okay, what about the New York Times? I know there were some questions that came in from them. Are you on the call? Okay, what about NPR? Do we have anyone from NPR on the call who would like to ask a question? Okay, it seems like folks might be more comfortable with the chat. Let me finish this list. What about the Washington Post? Is anyone from the Washington Post on this call and would like to ask a question? Okay, Houston Chronicle. Okay, what about WFAA in Dallas? Okay, KPRC, Houston. Okay, well, I will start reading off some of these questions. Can you address how the locations chosen to be disconnected are selected, and are they left up to local providers to decide?
Yes, the locations that are disconnected are left up to the local utility providers. Ercot's role is to tell those utilities when the supply-demand is out of balance and we feel like there's a threat to the security of the grid, that we need, X amount of megawatts to be reduced on the demand side, so that, outages are caused by that. So that's what we ask for from them. And it's based on a set percentage that is allocated to the different utilities in Texas, primarily based on their size. And then once that is given to them, it is up to those utilities to decide how to implement outages. And for example, some utilities may have critical care customers that they want to identify and try to avoid outages. But that is up to those local utilities. We don't have a role in implementing it because they know their areas better. They know what's going to be better for their population. We just need them to commit to bring us back the number of megawatts we need to keep the grid in balance.
Okay, I'm going to move on to KAVU TV. Why are certain areas and cities experiencing an upwards of 20+ blackouts in the last 24 hours, while other areas have not experienced any blackouts?
Let's get to that.
Yeah, so basically, as Bill said, the transmission owners, the folks that own the wires that are used to transmit power out to load, determine how much, where and what neighborhoods and those kind of things are used for these kind of outages. Once we tell them the kind of the quantity that needs to be reduced. And so there may be areas where, as Bill mentioned, there are critical care facilities, places like hospitals or emergency response facilities, those kind of things that are not that need to retain their power, and they're called critical care. And so those may not be included in the plan, and other areas that don't have those facilities may be undergoing longer outages. And so it's really just up to the transmission companies to decide those things based on the amounts that we tell them.
Okay, I think there may be an issue with folks being able to unmute and ask those questions, so I will continue to follow the chat. I've also received a few texts, so if you do have a question, please submit it via the chat, and I will try to get to it. This is Eva Parks with KXAS. How did COVID impact winter weatherization efforts this year? I know you were in the middle of spot checks from November to February. How many were you able to conduct, and how many were you not able to do?
So we conduct these winterization spot checks for generators who the generators submit a plan to the PUC for their how they're planning to winterize their facility, and then we go out and do spot checks of whether they're following that plan or not, and help to disseminate the best practices for those kind of winterization of plans for their plant. Typically, we send someone out to walk through the plant with them, along with some of the NERC regional entity representatives. And we typically do that for about 100 of the 600 or so plants every year. I think this year, because of COVID, we did that as a tabletop exercise, but we still went through the same process with the management of those plants. I believe we did 94 of those this year. So we hit the same number of plants. We try to focus on the ones that have either had problems in the past or are new plants and may not have had that kind of aware of the best practices and those kind of things. But we were able to do that for a typical number of plants this year.
Okay, next question. How many different plants and generators have failed in this event?
Yeah, so I don't have the breakout of the number of plants in front of me. We know how many megawatts there were, but plants are of different sizes. So we have that information, obviously, but I don't have it on this sheet.
From KRTK, what concern is there about Wednesday's storm and it negating a lot of the work being done to improve distribution?
Well, I think I'd say at the outset, the temperatures, the extreme nature of what we saw Sunday, Monday, still today, we're not out of it yet, the extremely low temperatures and then the snow that we saw, the freezing precipitation we saw, we're still expecting it to be quite cold in Texas, but I don't think we're showing on the forecast that it's as severe as what we saw earlier in the week. And as temperatures rise, that helps us because it helps with gas supply, it helps with de-icing wind turbine blades. The sun coming out helps. That helps us give us a lot more of our solar power on the system, which we saw quite a bit of yesterday as the sun finally came out after a few days. So the even I wouldn't say minor, but changes where you're still feeling cold can make a difference as far as the factors that we're looking at. But again, we need to see what that weather actually brings. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to see some improvement in a number of areas, even though we're still seeing quite a bit of cold weather.
Okay, looks like Bloomberg posted a chart on Twitter that shows that loads are not getting any better. Will this turn around as the weather improves?
Yes, we as Bill just mentioned, as things start to warm back up, and some of the issues that we've been having really across the board, because weather is really severe. This really kind of unprecedented severe weather is what's driving this issue on multiple fronts. But as weather improves and we start getting warmer temperatures, most of those things that are driving, well, in fact, all of those things that are driving the outages of generation, the issues on the natural gas system as a whole, and so forth, all should diminish as the temperatures increase.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read off a few more, and then we're going to see if we have corrected the muting situation so that you all can ask questions. Let's see, what tangible plan does Ercot have in place to prevent this kind of supply-demand imbalance from happening again during an inclement weather event in the future?
Yeah, so we, I guess in general, we have plans in place to cover kind of normal extreme weather conditions. This one's a little beyond our normal extreme weather. After some issues we had with cold weather back in 2011, where we had some plants that tripped offline during that situation back in February of 2011, we put in place these winterization process, the checking process. The generation in our area, and in fact nationally, created some best practices that they would implement. And all of those were kind of geared around that 2011 level of detail, the severity of that storm. And like I said earlier, this one's kind of beyond what we saw in 2011. So we will go in. One of the things we will definitely go in is work with the generation entities and anyone else that helps us with that, and try to beef up that plan to the point that it's able to handle this, what we now understand to be even possibility of more extreme weather than what we had experienced in the past. So that's one thing, and I'm sure we're going to be looking at these in kinds of things in much more detail. But really, our focus at this point has been more on trying to keep the system together so that we can restore power to consumers as fast as possible. We're really working this event now, and then we'll go in and start working on the process improvements and lessons learned and making sure that it won't happen again.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, I'm going to pause just for a second and see if we can address this mute situation.
Good Lord.
Okay. All right.
Oh my gosh, just
Okay, we're going to stick to the process that has been working thus far, so I'm going to keep going. I've got a lot more questions and text coming through. So are all energy companies being asked to cut the same percentage from their grids?
So the amount that each transmission provider, when we ask for, say, 1,000 megawatts of load reduction on the system, the share that each transmission provider has to reduce in their area is dependent on their share of the overall system demand on the system. So if you have one utility that has 20% of the demand on the system that's hooked up to their wires, then if we're reducing 1,000 megawatts, they will have to reduce their demand by 20% of that 1,000 megawatts. And that can make sure that the reductions are equitably distributed amongst the different wires companies. And it also, from a technical standpoint, it winds up, since different wires companies are responsible for serving load in different areas of the state, it also makes sure that the reductions are spread across the whole state and everything can better be held in balance.
Okay, I am going to keep down this list. I know some of you have commented about the unmuting. We did attempt to unmute everyone, but there's just too much background noise for us to go that route. So unfortunately, we have to keep the line muted, and I will continue to address these questions as best I can. The next one is, can you explain the PUC order?
The PUC met in an emergency meeting yesterday. Because as we were managing this situation, observed, and I think some of our market participants observed, that the scarcity pricing mechanism, we call it, the prices that apply when we are in energy emergency alerts that are set to incentivize generators to provide maximum supply during those alerts. There were some distortions in how they were being calculated. They weren't being calculated incorrectly, but in an event like this, we were observing for the first time some impacts of the formula, I'd say, of how those prices were calculated. And I think we and others were not really happy with what we were seeing in the scarcity pricing, given the obvious scarcity and need to bring everything on that we had. So the commission met yesterday in an emergency meeting and made a change to that mechanism, enabled us to put a software change in last night to, while we're in this emergency condition, apply this pricing rule that we think is going to be even more effective in our ability to keep generation on at its maximum throughout the event.
How much of the total generation on forced outage was just gas?
I actually don't have that number either. I apologize. Certainly going into the event prior to this tripping of generation, we knew that there would be some finite amount, very well known amount of generators that were going to have gas restrictions on them. But the units that tripped offline starting Sunday night were a mix of resources, but I don't have that breakout in front of me.
Okay, Can you address the criticism that the loss of wind generation is primarily to blame for the outages in the state? Is that true or no?
Well, I mean, the numbers that I did quote earlier, where we do have a breakout between wind and solar resources and thermal generation, being gas, coal, and nuclear, the breakout is roughly, right now it's 16,000 megawatts of what we got renewable generation, wind and solar, and of the 28 or 29,000 megawatts of thermal generation. Now, those numbers, I should note, include both generators that went out since Sunday, and also some that were out in advance of that because of these gas curtailments and so forth. But really, I mean, if that may be a way of answering the question, is that there is, significantly more megawatts in that thermal unit category than in the renewable category, as far as what's out during this particular event at the current time.
And I just add to what Dan's saying, overall, as Dan emphasized before, we're seeing the loss across the various generation types. And it really, those losses came at pretty much the same time as we saw this storm sweep through and have its impacts on lots of different kinds of generation. So I think it's the weather, the storm that brought the issues to lots of different kinds of resources, and obviously working with all of them to try to bring as many of those of all kinds back to get on the system.
Okay, let's see. Next one. When did Ercot realize that this storm would be worse than the projections, and what last-minute steps were taken to prepare for it?
Yeah, so actually, from a planning perspective, on Monday, the 8th of February, our meteorologists were recognizing that this was going to be a really severe storm. And so we issued what's called an operating condition notice for extreme cold weather. We issued that out to market participants. We asked the generators to make sure that they had reviewed their fuel supplies and had fuel available, that they implemented their winterization procedures. So that started on Monday, the February 8th. And then we ratcheted